Chapter 3: The Birth of Psychological Atrophy. The first time I wrote the word psychological atrophy, I didn't mean to name a theory. I was trying to name a feeling, that slow, internal weakening that comes when you keep trying to connect but nothing connects back. It was not dramatic. It was quiet. Like watching color fade from a painting you used to love. For years, I had felt something draining from me, not hope exactly, but capacity. The capacity to trust, to reach out, to stay motivated, to imagine. Everything that once came naturally began to feel heavy, like lifting weights underwater. One night, sitting in a recovery room with my coffee cooling beside me, it hit me. This must be what happens to a muscle that's never used, I wrote. And if it happens to the body, maybe it happens to the mind. That was the birth of the idea, and eventually, the language that would help me understand what emotional neglect does, not just to individuals, but to entire societies. Defining psychological atrophy. Here is how I define it now: weakening. In plain language, it is what happens when the mind stops believing it matters. And like muscle atrophy, it does not occur from a single wound. It happens through disuse, the long, repetitive absence of nourishment and engagement. You do not notice it right away. You just wake up one day realizing you cannot remember the last time you felt joy without permission. From muscle to mind. When a muscle goes unused, its fibers shrink. When a person goes unseen, their confidence does. Neuroscientists call this neural pruning, the brain's tendency to weaken pathways that aren't stimulated. Social psychologists call it learned helplessness. I call it the biology of hopelessness. Research shows that chronic emotional neglect changes brain structures involved in empathy, reward, and regulation. People raised or trapped in emotionally cold environments show reduced gray matter in regions responsible for decision-making and stress resilience. The same pattern appears in adults experiencing long-term isolation, including the elderly, prisoners, and trauma survivors. What I felt as shrinking was literally my nervous system adapting to deprivation. It wasn't weakness, it was survival. My body was conserving energy the way a limb conserves energy after injury by not moving. That realization changed everything for me. Because it meant recovery wasn't about trying harder. It was about retraining what had been dormant. The stages of psychological atrophy. Every person's journey looks different, but the process often follows the same rhythm. Stage. Description. Emotional signature. 1. Deprivation. Repeated absence of validation, listening, or emotional safety. Confusion, loneliness, hypervigilance. 2. Disuse. To survive, the psyche begins to shut down its expressive systems. Emotional numbness, fatigue, detachment. 3. Degeneration. Without consistent relational feedback, self-worth and motivation decline. Apathy, despair, loss of identity. 4. Dependency or despair. The person either collapses inward or clings outward, seeking external proof of value. Panic, overcompensation, addiction. 5. Adaptation or awakening. With belonging and safety restored, new neural and emotional pathways emerge. Relief, growth, re-engagement with life. In short, what disuse breaks, use can rebuild. But it must be safe, steady, and seen. My own descent. When I trace back the beginning of my own psychological atrophy, it didn't start with crisis, it started with subtle exclusions. A phone call not returned. A boundary drawn without context. Moments of silence that were supposed to teach tough love but instead taught fear. Each instance felt small, but cumulatively, they rewired me. I began to anticipate rejection. I filtered every conversation through survival. Is this safe? Should I say that? Am I too much? That mental overcompensation created exhaustion that no amount of rest could fix. And slowly, my capacity to hope began to collapse. I stopped reaching out not because I wanted distance, but because I couldn't bear the weight of unanswered effort. This is what we misunderstand about emotional withdrawal. People don't isolate because they want to be alone. They isolate because they've learned that reaching out burns. Why this matters beyond the individual. Psychological atrophy doesn't just harm people, it harms society. When a person's inner world shrinks, their ability to contribute, create, and care shrinks with it. A worker struggling with burnout isn't just tired, they're undernourished emotionally. A young adult drifting from goal to goal isn't lazy, they're disconnected. A community divided by fear isn't immoral, it's collectively atrophied. If domestic discrimination is the injury, psychological atrophy is the symptom. And if we scale that injury across millions of families, we begin to understand why poverty, crime, and corruption persist even in wealthy nations. Because the emotional foundation, empathy, trust, belonging has been quietly collapsing for decades. The science of disuse. Neuroscience provides stunning parallels between physical and psychological degradation. Social isolation activates the same pain centers as physical injury. Loneliness increases mortality risk more than obesity or smoking. Chronic rejection disrupts dopamine and serotonin systems, dulling motivation and pleasure. Neglect in childhood alters the amygdala and hippocampus, the brain's emotional and memory hubs. In essence, emotional neglect deconditions the brain. And yet, most societies still treat emotional safety as optional, a luxury instead of infrastructure. We wouldn't let a limb rot from disuse without therapy, yet we let millions of minds waste away without belonging. How families create the perfect conditions. Families are where this atrophy begins because they are where identity first learns to move. When the environment discourages emotional expression or punishes difference, the developing psyche loses its flexibility. A child learns to suppress rather than express, to apologize for existing rather than for mistakes, to anticipate criticism instead of connection. These become reflexes, mental postures that persist into adulthood. They shape how we work, love, and lead. Domestic discrimination isn't just emotional neglect, it's relational malnutrition. It deprives us of the nutrients that make life meaningful: affirmation, safety, dialogue, touch, humor, forgiveness. When these nutrients are missing, the emotional immune system fails. That's when people get sick in other ways: addiction, anger, self-sabotage, overachievement that never feels enough. A society of numbness. Walk down any busy city street and you'll see it: the dull stare of exhaustion, the transactional conversations, the constant self-protection. We call it stress, but beneath it lies something deeper: a population trained to disconnect. We're surrounded by people who've stopped feeling fully because feeling has never felt safe. That's not apathy, it's adaptation. It's why social media addiction thrives. It offers the illusion of engagement without the risk of vulnerability. It's why corruption survives, moral sensitivity dulls when empathy atrophies. And it's why poverty persists. Communities can't lift one another when everyone's emotional arms are too weak to reach out. Psychological atrophy isn't an individual diagnosis, it's a collective condition. How healing begins. The good news, and the reason I believe so strongly in recovery, is that the mind, like the body, is plastic. It can rebuild. Even after years of silence, the right kind of relationship reawakens dormant capacities. Healing begins when someone offers consistent, safe connection, not rescue, but recognition. When another person looks at you and says, "I see you. You don't have to perform here." That's the moment the internal muscles twitch again. At first, it's awkward, even painful. Vulnerability after long neglect feels like physical therapy for the soul, uncomfortable but vital. Over time, the mind remembers its strength. That's what happened to me at Reaching Out Recovery. Each conversation, each shared laugh, each honest moment reintroduced motion into my emotional life. My panic lessened not because the world became easier, but because belonging made it survivable. Why naming it matters. Language is medicine. When we name something invisible, we give it shape, and once it has shape, it can be healed. For decades, emotional neglect has been dismissed as soft trauma. By naming its consequence, psychological atrophy, we reposition it as a legitimate, measurable, and preventable form of harm. The phrase bridges science and empathy. It satisfies researchers because it's biologically plausible. It comforts survivors because it acknowledges their fatigue isn't weakness, it's the physics of disuse. Every social movement begins with a new language. This is ours. Closing reflection. If trauma is the wound, then psychological atrophy is the scar tissue, the stiffness that remains when healing has never been allowed to finish. But like all living systems, the psyche is regenerative. The muscles of trust, love, and belonging can be rebuilt. All they need is safety, repetition, and time. The next chapter, The Anatomy of Domestic Discrimination, will explore the specific forces that cause this atrophy to take root, how control, silence, and shame form a self-reinforcing system that keeps individuals weak and families fractured. Because to cure a disease, we first must see its design. End of Chapter 3. The Birth of Psychological Atrophy. Chapter 4. The Anatomy